So welcome. We'll get started in just a few minutes at 12:35. I think we're mostly here, just waiting on Dalton. How was your 3-day weekend, by the way? Yeah, I can't say if the days are moving slower, if they're moving faster, but yeah, it's definitely in a different time sphere with everything as is and being home. It's hard to kind of keep it's definitely been hard to keep track of what day of the week it is. So we're at 12:35. Everybody's here, so I'm gonna get started with our stream for today, or what the plan is for today. So we started on this words example application using the room database on Friday last week. So what we're going to do next is kind of finish up the first part of that lab. And then we'll come back and talk about it some more. I am working on grades for your tests. I'm sorry that those have been a bit delayed. There's been a bit as far as getting everything up to speed and whatnot for lesson 9 and 10 that I hadn't really anticipated for. So that's taken some of my time. But I'm working on those right now. I've got some of those graded, but not all of them. So I hope to have those back sometime this week. So where we're at right now, I want to finish up this first part of it. Last thing we have left to do here is add a button to add a new word to the database. So we'll do that. And then what I want to do is do a review of our last hands-on test. Okay. So once we've done that review and we've talked about all those things, that will then put us into a place where we can really talk about how do we make an application that involves both network resources as well as database resources, because typically it's not one or the other. Usually it's a combination of both. So that's where the hands-on test is maybe a good place to talk about, what if I want to sometimes store the articles in the database and sometimes retrieve them from the internet. So that'll give us a better kind of sample application to talk about some other things, which is why I'm kind of timing it here. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about databases and files and settings, and then kind of return to the whole hands-on test of what do we do with network resources and background threads and such. So that's where that lands. So if you would, you want to pull up the sample application that we worked on Friday. That should be your room word sample or room word sample live, whichever of those two you called it. So where we're going to start there is adding this new activity. So this new activity kind of will look like this. It's just a simple text box where you can type in a word, and then it's got a save button. Okay, so pull that up here. Okay, so to start that out, and to just refresh on where we're at, remember what we did on Friday is set this up to go ahead and pull these words from the database and display them in their shackle view. So we've got a database there. I want to add a new activity so we can start adding words. So I'm going to go new activity. we're going to create a new empty activity. And this new activity we'll call the new word activity. Okay, I'm going to hit finish on that. Yep, I do want to add that. Okay, so there I have my activity class, and let's look at the layout. Okay, so we need to add a few things to that layout. Namely, we need to add a edit text, and then we also need to add that button. So I'm going to drag in the edit text first. So this is just going to be a plain text, and then I want the button beneath that as well. Okay, I'm going to set up all the constraints as usual. Just anchor it to the left, right, and top. I'm going to set all of those to 16. And then I'm also going to anchor the button to the left, the right, and the bottom of the edit text. Same thing here. I want those to be 16 dp margins. Okay. Once I've set those two things, I want to expand them both to be match constraints, so they'll take up the full width. So that's the basic kind of layout of the controls. I still need to give them IDs, so let's go ahead and do that. So the first one I'm just going to leave as edit text. That'll be fine. And button, yeah, so I'm going to just leave those default IDs. That will be good. Actually, I'm going to change that to save button. Save button. And maybe I'll call that, yeah, word input. Yeah, let's just give those some names. Okay, so those two have been renamed. I've got the word input and the save button. On the save button, I want to change this text to be save. Okay. And over on the input, I'm going to remove the text, and I just want a placeholder there. So my hint is going to be word ... So I've got a hint of word, and then I've got a button with the text of save. Okay. So now that I've done those pieces, I'm going to go back to the text of this. Okay, so we can see the text there. And what I want to do is apply some of the styles that we created in the last lecture to these controls. So here, I'm going to apply style is equal to, we have an edit text style. So I'm going to use the edit text style for that input. And I'm going to use the button style for this one. So style, button style. Okay, so that should make both of those controls look a lot better, look kind of like what's in the example here. I also, while I'm here, I want to extract these two bits of text. So rather than just having them hard-coded into the layout file, we want to extract them to strings. So I'm going to go on the hint. I'm going to extract this as string resources, and this is going to be our hint underscore word. Okay, and this is going to be extract string resource, and this is going to be our save button. Okay, so both of those things are set up. I also want to add an on-click to my button so I can start handling events for it. So on-click, I'm going to call this on-save. Hit Alt-Enter, and then we're going to create that method in the new word activity. Okay, so there I've got my on-save event, and that's everything I need to do to set up the layout. Okay, so we've got our basic layout there. Now I do want to next add some navigation so that there's a way to get to this activity. So let's go into the main activity, and we want to start working with that. Now, if I look at the layout for the main activity, you'll notice I do have a button here, an FAB, floating action button. That's what I want to hook up to go over to the new word activity. So first things first, with that button, I do want to change the icon. So I'm going to go to the drawable folder, right-click that, say New Image Asset, because what we want is a little plus icon. So I'm going to go to Action Bar and Tab Icons, and I'm going to call this IC Add. I'm going to look in here for that add icon. Okay, so there it's called Add. Okay, so I've got an IC Add. This is a light color, which I believe is what I want, hollow dark. So let's hit Next and Finish. Go ahead and add those to version control. Yep. All right, cool. So just double checking, we have an IC Add here now, which is a little plus icon. Okay, so let's go to Activity Main, and I'm going to change the icon for the FAB. So right now it's using this built-in Android icon. I want to change that over to my icon that I just created. So that's going to be drawable IC Add. Okay, so our icon's changed. I also want to be able to hook up an on-click listener here. So I'm just going to create that here, on-click, and we're going to call this, what did I call that? We're going to call this insert word. Insert word. Okay. Create the insert word method. All right, so that's down here. You'll see that's right above our async task that we created last time for getting all the words. So we'll also end up with another async task for inserting them, but we'll do that in a minute. So first thing I want to do is in this insert word, I want to have it redirect. I want to have it send the user over to the new activity, the new word activity. And to do that, we just need to call basically start activity. Now, I do want results back from that activity, at least the way that I'm going to set that up here. So I do need to call start activity for result. That's my intent. Okay, so I want to say start activity for result. We're going to create a new intent, and that intent, I need this and the activity class. So new word activity.class. And then if you remember right, I also need to supply a request code as that second argument. Okay, so rather than hard code it here, I want to create a constant for it. So I'm going to go to the top of main activity, and we're going to create a constant for that request code. So private static final int, and this is going to be the request. So request code, request new word. I'm going to just set that to 1. So that's the request code we're going to use to tell it what to send back, and that's how we're going to respond to it when we get the result from the other activity. So request new word is our constant there, and I've just set that to 1. And then going back to insert word, I can now supply that constant as my second argument. Okay, so when you click the plus icon, the FAB, we'll call start activity for result, passing in that intent. Okay, so then the next part of the work is that needs to it kind of needs to do the handling and the looking of getting the word and sending it back, and then inserting that word back here. So let's just do a quick run with what we have here, just to make sure that we can navigate to the new word activity and that it has the proper icon. Okay, so I've got a plus icon here. I'm going to click on that, and there we go. Okay. Now, two things I notice about this new word activity that I want to change. First of all, I notice that there's no up arrow. There's no way back, at least as far as the user is concerned, there's no way back to the list, as well as the label hasn't really changed. The name of the activity isn't really there. So I want to change both of those things. So we want to go to the manifest where we can do that. Okay. So in the manifest, I want to change the label of that activity as well as the parent activity. Okay. So let's get rid of the errors here so it's not yelling at us. I'm going to hit Alt-Enter, suppress, add tools, ignore, allow backup, Alt-Enter, suppress, Google index warning. Okay. So now just looking at the new word activity, which is here, cleaning things up a little bit. So under the new word activity, I need to define the label, and that'll be the title of that screen. So Android label is equal to new word. Okay, that's what the title of that screen is going to be. I also want to specify the parent activity. So parent activity name is main activity, and I also need to add that meta tag. So metadata, Android name is Android dot support dot parent activity. Parent activity, and the value is dot main activity. Okay, so we specified the parent is main, so that we'll get that up arrow, and then we've also specified that the label is new word. Now, the new word, I don't really want to hard code here. I really want to extract that to a string file, a strings XML. So we're going to extract that string resource as activity, as action new word. That's how I'm going to do that. So action new word is the name of that text. Okay. Just to check those two things, let's go ahead and test it. So I'm going to hit plus, and there we go. So I've got the arrow, and it says new word instead. So I can hit back anytime I want, and that'll just take me back to the list. Okay. Now we can start actually implementing the logic that goes into that new word activity. So in that new word activity, first of all, I know that I'm going to need the edit text that's there that contains the word. So private edit text. Create a member variable to store that control. Okay. And then in here, I want to get that. So medit text is equal to find view by ID, r dot ID dot, I think that was word input. What did I call it? I think I called it word input. So why is that not popping up? Word input. Let's hit the build button just to make sure that it gets up to date. but it's not finding my word input. Word input. Autofill hints. No, that should find it. One error found. So where is the error? Cannot resolve ID word input. So, yeah, that is strange. I'm going to go close all that. I'm going to hit under build, I'm going to hit rebuild project. Let that go a minute. Got the progress bar down here is done now. And ID word input still not found. Okay. So let's well, let's just rename it. We'll put a different name there. So I'm just going to call it edit text. So I'm just going to call it edit text there. And then let's go back. Text. So calling it edit text seems to not have an issue. I'm not sure what I missed, but I must have missed something along the way when I changed the name. So there's my edit text. And now I can actually start hooking up an event to listen for that. So when we hit save, I want to grab the word that the user entered. String word is equal to edit text dot get text dot toString. And so I've grabbed the word, and then I'm going to say, is it empty or not? So text utils, if the user has entered a word, then I'm going to go ahead and send that back to the main activity. But if the user hasn't entered a word, then we're going to just show a toast and say, hey, you need to enter a word. So here, if it is empty, if the word is empty, we're going to show a toast. Otherwise, we're going to send the reply. Okay. So here, toast dot make text. We want the user to know that, hey, they need to enter a word. Please enter a word, and we'll make that toast dot length long dot show. Give the user enough time to see it. And otherwise, we want to send the user back to the original activity. So intent, this is we'll call this the reply intent. Create a new intent object here. And then we need to add an extra to that intent. So that extra needs to include the word. So I'm going to go ahead and define that constant for the extra. So public static final string. This is the extra word. I'm just going to set that to the string word. Okay. So extra word is our constant there, and we can add that actual extra to the intent. So reply intent dot put extra. And I want to put in the name of the extra, which is word. and then word, which is the value. So the word that the user entered is what we're going to treat as the value. Okay, and then I need to set the result. So we're going to set the result here. So the result code is result OK, because in this case everything's good. And then add the reply intent that we want to return, which is going to include that the word that the user actually entered, and finally finish. So we want to close the activity and get the user back to where they were. Okay. Now, Dalton, you were saying you have a problem with main activity. You say you fixed the constant. Where is it complaining now? What's the error message that you're getting? Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and run this to just give it a quick check. So I'm going to hit I'm going to hit plus, and we're going to hit save. So there we've got our toast. Please enter word if I leave it blank. And if I type something in, it's going to go ahead and send it back here. Now it's not showing that word yet, and it's not inserting it into the database. So those are both things we need to fix. So let's go into, let's go back to main activity now and actually hook up the logic to receive that new word. Okay. So remember, when we call start activity for result, we then need to implement another method to retrieve that result. Okay. So the method we need to implement is on activity result. And then we're going to say if two things, if the request code is equal to that request code that we used up here, which is that request new word, and the result code is result OK, then we're going to go ahead and proceed. So if either of those two things are different, we're not going to do something. The request code being different would mean, hey, that you're maybe opening up another activity or doing something else. So that would be a whole different set of logic. But if it's not a result OK, that would mean something like they canceled it by hitting the back the back button on their keyboard or the up navigation in that activity. Okay. The other thing we so in here, now that we've got that, we can start actually handling that logic. So let's grab the word that we added in the extra. So string word is equal to data dot get string extra, and the name of that, we're going to pull that from name word dot extra word. The reason I'm able to do that is because I marked that constant as public. If I marked that as private, this would give me an error. So you want to make sure that you've marked that constant public here, so we can get to it from another class. Okay, so that's the word that the user entered. And so maybe let's just show a toast here just to make sure that that's coming through. So toast dot make text this, and we're going to show the word, and then we need the length of that. So length long show. So we can check that real quick just to make sure we're actually getting the word back. so that's good. So I'm seeing the word that I typed in. And then I want to actually insert that word into the database. So naively, you might say, well, okay, so let's just call db.insert, right? Let's take the database, database.getWordDO.insert, and let's insert a word. Now, if we look at what insert takes in this word DO, remember that it needs a word object. It doesn't need a single string. It doesn't know what to do with a string. It needs an actual word object. So when you're inserting data into the database, you have to insert an entity. Okay, so we can't just insert a string or an integer. We have to actually insert some sort of entity. So here I need to create a new word object to hold that word string. So here we can add in word. And this may seem a little bit weird. It's mainly that way because we have an entity or a table that only has one column. It would make maybe a little bit more sense if we had an entity here that had more than one column. But the way this one is set up, it only has that one column. So let's say we write it out like that, right? So we've got our logic to grab the word, show it in a toast, and we've added this line in to insert that word into the database. Okay, so let's give that a try and see what happens. Now what we're going to see as soon as I hit save there, you'll notice that my application has crashed. Okay, so let's look at logcat and see why. Why has my application crashed? Kind of scrolling through the error. There we go. There's the error of interest. Okay, so it says that there's an illegal state exception. Okay, when I try to do that insert in main activity Java line 84, it's saying cannot access the database on the main thread since it may potentially lock the UI for a long period of time. So if you remember, we ran into the same error, yes, on Friday, or it's not Friday, Thursday, where when we were trying to do the select, we also had to do that on a background thread. So anything that we do with the database using room has to be on the background thread. Really, regardless of what database you're doing, you really should do all database interaction on a background thread. That's just generally considered good practice. So in order to do that, we need to spin up another async task to do that work. Okay, so if you remember what we did last time, we created this get all words task as an async task, and it did the database logic in do in background. So we need to do the same thing for inserting words. Okay, so I'm going to comment this line of code here out. Okay, I don't want to insert the word here. If I do, that'll continue causing an exception. But I'm going to move this logic here into a background thread. So that will also be happening off of the main thread. Okay, so let's add another private class down here. So private class insert word task. And this is going to extend async task. Now the question is, what types do we need? Okay, so we've got the three. We have the parameters, which are the inputs. We have the progress, and then we have the result. Well, given that we need to insert a word, I think, well, maybe we need to take a word as a parameter. Probably need to take that as an input. I don't really need to show any progress, but I do want to have a result at the end. So my result at the end is going to be a word object. So here we need to implement the, now that we've got those types in there, I can implement the methods. So I'm going to go Alt-Enter, bring this up. So you need to implement the do in background method. So you'll see the do in background method takes a word, a series of words. You can actually also write this method, also implement it just using a word array. Typically we're going to call this parameter here params. I know that by default it fills it in as the name of the type, but usually we're just going to name this parameter here params. So it's the params to the execute method of the task. Okay, I did the same thing up here where I just renamed it to params. Okay, but that's worth noting. Sometimes that can make it a little bit easier to read if you just change it to a word array. Remember what it is. So here I want to say let's insert that word. So first let's get the word object. So word is equal to params 0, because we're going to end up passing this in as the first parameter to the execute method, and we're not going to have any other parameters. And then at the end I want to return the word. The reason I'm returning the word is because I want to then display it in the UI after it's been inserted. Okay. If I didn't return the word, then I potentially wouldn't have a way to display it, or I'd have to refresh all of the items in the list. I'd have to pull them all from the database again in order to do that. So I'm just going to return the word that was just added. Okay. Now between there, that's where we can actually do the work of inserting it into the database. So I'm going to go to mdatabase dot getWordDAO dot insert, and we're going to insert that word. Okay, that's good. And then I just want to implement on post execute. On post execute, there we are. Inside of on post execute, we want to then display that word. Okay, so I want to show it in the list of words. So m words, that's my list. We're going to add it. Add the word, and then I'm going to just tell the adapter that there are new words. And this works simply from the perspective that the adapter is already connected to that list of words. So with that assumption in mind, that should refresh it. Okay, so that's my task. So it's simply in the background, it's going to insert the word into the database. When that's done, I'll then show the word in the recycler view. Okay. So let's hook up this task now so it actually gets run at the appropriate time. So going back up to here, okay, in our on activity result, we're going to say, we're going to start that new task. So new insert word task, and then we need to execute it. Okay. So execute, we need to pass in the word object. So new word, create the word object, run it. That's it. So we create the task, we execute it, and that's in response to the on activity result. Okay, so let's try to add a word now. Okay, I'm going to try to add thing, hit save. Okay, cool. So you can see that it's appearing now at the bottom of the list. Now let's say I add another word, or call it alligator. And you'll notice it's still appearing at the bottom, right? So I'm not really paying attention to the ordering of the list. The reason the list was ordered originally is because when I call the getAllWords method, if I look at what's in that DAO, we can see that there's an order by clause that is ordering it by the words. So if I was really going to make this maybe better, I might need to take that into consideration. I might need to take in the ordering of the list and insert it at the proper place instead of inserting it at the bottom. But the way that things are going to end up as we transition to using live data and view model, it's going to automatically do another request to the database and put it in that order. So I don't need to actually fix that problem right now. It'll be fixed when we move over to live data. So one thing that is an issue though, so remember we're inserting this word and then we're just saying, okay, it's all good. Let's put it into the list. Now what happens if I say insert a word that's already there, right? So Cobra is already on the list. Let's try to insert Cobra. Oh, it crashed. That's not good. So it's crashing if the word is already in the database. Okay, and if we look at the look at logcat, maybe we can figure out why. Okay, so if I look at logcat, here it says SQLite constraint exception, unique constraint failed, right? So effectively, because there's a primary key, the primary key also introduces a unique constraint on that column. So no two words can have the same word, or no two words can have the same key. So we're just trying to insert that word and not checking if that word is already there. Okay. So I may need to put in some logic to check for that rather than just letting it crash. So if I backtrack a little bit, we can see that happens. It's thrown from the insert method, the word do insert method. If I backtrack here to line 114, there we go. So we can see this is the line that's throwing that exception. Okay. So typically when I have an exception that's being thrown, and you can see that it's crashing the entire application, that's definitely a place where I want to put a try, right? So I want to put a try there to try and catch that word, okay? Catch that exception. So let's say we try, and then let's catch. And this is as I can see with the stack trace, I can see that this is a SQLite constraint exception. I'll enter, there we go. So if I get a constraint exception, I'd really like to tell the user about it, okay? Really like to tell the user that there is a problem. Well, let's think about what we could do. Maybe we could show a toast, right? Maybe we could say toast.makeText this, and pass in the string I want to show. So ex.getMessage, show the message, length long dot show. Okay. Now there is a complaint here. It's complaining about the fact that this isn't really defined. This currently refers to my task, which isn't a context. If I put in main activity.this, that would solve it. The other way I can do this, and this is the route I'm going to do, because I may want to move where this toast is shown, or I may want to show a toast more than one place. So I'm going to actually make a method here before both of these tasks. I'm going to make it a public method, public void display toast. So I'm going to use this in all the places that I'm going to need to show toasts in this activity. So string, you know the message that we want to show, and now I can actually show that toast. So make text this message length long dot show. So rather than writing that logic every time I kind of need it, I'm going to call display toast to kind of put that into one place. So that's my display toast method. I'm going to come back to where I was, and we're going to call that here. So we're going to call display toast in response to that SQLite constraint exception. Let's start with just the message, right? So let's say we show that message. Now we can see if I try to run it, it's going to complain that I don't have a return statement. So let's just say, for now, let's return word. I may need to move that outside the try so I have access to it. Okay, there we go. So move it up outside the try. Now I can return the word in either pathway. So let's try to add Cobra again. So I'm going to try to add Cobra. Something still didn't work out right. So now what we see here, can't toast on a thread that's not called loop or prepare. Okay, so there's a problem. I cannot display toasts on background threads. Okay, so you can't show a toast from a service. You can't really show a toast from a background, from an async task in the do in background method. So if I want to show that toast, I really do need to do it back in the main thread. Okay, so what that means is I can't show the toast here, but I can show it in on post execute. Okay. So what are some thoughts? What are some solutions that would allow me to do that? How can I move this toast from do in background to on post execute? Because I can't show it in do in background. I have to show it in on post execute. So I've got a few things like limitations that I'm kind of stuck with. So do in background can't throw exceptions. If it throws an exception, as you saw, it crashes the application. It doesn't get caught anywhere if do in background throws an exception. And I don't necessarily want to add any sort of fields to my task, simply because I may want to reuse this task to do maybe other things in the future, or maybe I need to have other things going on. So I don't necessarily want to add more. I don't necessarily want to add more fields to the task class. Okay. Now, what is true? Remember, I have control over the type that I return, right? So that third parameter to async task is in my control, okay? So I could potentially I could change the return type to include that exception, okay? To include the information about the exception if something went wrong with the process, okay? So, well, how do I do that? If I say the return type is word, then I can only return a word. and that does allow me to return null, but I could get null in more than one case. So I don't want to necessarily say, hey, it returns null, let's display this particular error message. That puts me in a place where all I can say is something went wrong. And that's not really good. So I want to be able to return an exception sometimes, right? Well, if I change the type to exception, well, then I also can't return the word, right? I need to be able to return either a word or an exception. Effectively, that's what I'm trying to do, okay? Now, Alex, you're asking, could I move this check into the new word activity? Yes, I could, but I still would need to run it on a background thread. So I'd still be back to where I am right now, where my problem is that I need to do this on a background thread. I need to do the insertion on a background thread, catch the exception on the background thread, and then display the error over on the main thread. Okay. So I did show you one way to do this maybe back a few chapters ago, but it bears some refreshing. So the way I'm going to work around this, I'm going to say, well, let's create a new class that can handle these types of situations, right? Because sometimes my async task will need to return an exception, and sometimes they will be successful and need to return a result object. So I'm actually going to create another data type, which is going to allow me to do one or the other. Okay, I'm going to use some generics to define that data type so I don't have to create multiple copies of it. So I'm going to create a class here, new Java class. We're going to call this async task result. So this is going to be generic enough that we could really use it any time that we have an async task that might fail, which most of the time your async tasks can fail. That's kind of that kind of comes with the territory, because most of the things that we do in the background are also things that involve either the network or parsing data, parsing JSON, parsing XML, or working with the network. So all of these things can typically fail. So we kind of need to have a way to handle that. So I'm going to create this async task result class, and I'm going to genericize it. So I'm going to have a T parameter here, and that's going to allow me to say, well, what type of result would I like normally? Okay, so what type of result should normally be returned from this with this result? Okay, so in here we're going to create two fields. So the first one, both of these are going to be final because they're going to be immutable. So the first one is going to be of type T, and I'm going to call this result. So this is going to be, if everything goes successful, then the result will be in this variable. But if there is any sort of problem, then I'm going to put it into another variable, which is going to be error. Okay, so if there's a problem, we're going to get an exception and store it in this error variable. And I'm going to add two constructors for this. So one that takes T, that takes a result, and the other one that takes an exception. So this is going to be public async task result. And this is going to be T result. And in this case, this dot result is equal to result, and this dot error is equal to null. So in this case, it went through successfully. You gave me the actual result object, and I'm going to save that. And I'm going to mark that there's no exception. Okay. And then I'm going to add another constructor. So public async task result. This one's going to take an exception, which is the error. So if it's successful, you're going to construct it with this constructor. If it's unsuccessful, then we'll construct it here with this exception. Okay. So if it's unsuccessful, this dot result is equal to null. We don't have a result, but we do have an error. So this dot error is equal to error. Now, just a quick refresher on why I'm using the word this dot here. That's because I have two variables with the same name. So typically, a parameter or a local variable will shadow a member variable by the same name. So that's one of the reasons that we typically use, sometimes we'll use the convention of starting all our member variables with M or with underscore. And that way we don't have the problem of shadowing where a parameter is shadowing a member variable if we call a member variable with the different naming convention. But if we're using the same name here, which is sometimes the Java standard, just to be forewarned, sometimes some people who are Java developers will start with M, some will start with underscore, some will just not have a prefix. So this is one coding convention. Right. So if we knew that it's always going to be potentially a word, then you wouldn't need this generic type. The reason I'm doing it this way is to kind of prep you for projects down the line, right? So if you have a project that's got three different data types, three different entities in the database, then you don't have to create an async task result for each one. Yeah, so it's going to allow you to reuse this class rather than creating 20 different copies of it, if that makes sense. So this is just a quick wrapper to kind of glue things together, but it's one that you can reuse. Okay, that's what that's about. Otherwise, without the genericizing, it wouldn't really be very reusable. So here I'm going to add public. We need to have getters for those two pieces. So get result is type T, and it returns the result. And then we've got public exception get error. And this returns the error. Now, I may want a Boolean method just for utility purpose, for shorthanding maybe the logic down the line. So I may want to have one here that returns a Boolean that says has error. So if it has an error, we're going to say return error does not equal null. So if there is an error, this is going to return true. If there is no error, this is going to return false. Okay. Any questions about this class? Again, the main reason I'm putting the generic in there is, yes, to reuse things. To reuse it. Given that we have everything we do with the database has to be run on a background thread, we could potentially end up with a lot of these async task results if we didn't do this. And I'm actually going to use this in two places in a minute as well, because there's another issue that we haven't maybe dealt with, because this isn't the only place that they can throw in exceptions. So we're starting to deal with insert word task, but you also have to remember that get all words task, this could also throw an exception. Okay, that get all words method could also throw an exception, which we're currently not dealing with, and that would cause our application to crash. So I'm actually really should be using it both of these tasks. So I'm going to get it working with this one, and then we'll come back and refactor the original to use that async task result. Okay. So now that I have my async task result object type, I'm going to change the third parameter to use that. So we're going to say, rather than returning a word, this is going to return an async task result word. Okay. So it's either going to contain a word or an exception. Okay. So in here, now I need to change the data type of do and background. So it returns that. So it's going to return an async task result word. And I need to change both of these returns to reflect that. So in this case, I'm going to return a new async task result, and that's going to wrap the word. And here I'm going to return a new async task result, and that's going to wrap the exception. Okay, so if it's successful, we're going to return our async task result. If it's unsuccessful, we're also going to return an async task result, but it's going to be exception here and a word there. Now, I do want to change this a little bit because I really do want to catch all exceptions. If anything were to go wrong at all, I do want to have a way to handle that. So rather than crashing the application, I'm going to just catch all exceptions here. Because any exception that would be thrown here would cause the application to crash, and I really don't want that to happen. So the other thing I might want to do in here is I might want to log that exception. Might want to log the exception here before I return it. So if I say, well, let's go up here and add a constant for that. So private static final string log tag, and that's going to be, we're in main activity, so it'll be main activity dot class dot get simple name. So just to remind you, that's to get the tag that we're going to use to log these messages. So I'm going to call that log underscore tag. Okay. So going back to our method here. Okay, so insert word tag. If there's an exception, then I want to log it. So log.e, I'm going to log it as an error because it is an error. And then we need to give it some sort of message. So here, what were we trying to do? Well, we were trying to insert a word, right? So a message that would make sense then is to say we failed to insert word. I'm going to add the exception. So that's going to provide it with this message up at the top and then a stack trace beneath there. So that's going to give me some more information to work with. Okay, so if it's good, we get that. Otherwise, we get an async task with an exception. So we fixed do in background. I also need to fix on post execute. So on post execute now also needs to take an async task result. So it's going to take an async task result word, and I'm going to change this to be the result. Okay, so I'm going to get a result object. If result dot has an error, if it has error, then we want to show a toast. We want to tell the user that there's a problem. Otherwise, I'm just going to display the word. Okay, so if it is successful, then here I'm going to say, well, let's get the word out. Word is equal to result dot get result. Okay, so that's good. And then if there is some sort of exception with, or some sort of error with inserting the word, then I want to display an exception, display the message here. So here I'm going to say display toast, and we're going to say result dot get error dot get message. So let's see what happens. Okay, so I'm going to run that. And in theory, if I add Cobra, it already exists, so it's going to end up down here. So Cobra, add it again, hit save. There we go. Okay, unique constraint failed. So first objective achieved. It's not crashing, right? So I can now add a word that's already in the database without having it crash. Okay. Now, I do maybe want to give the user a better error message because the error message that's there is really cryptic. The user's not going to know what that means. So I need to tell the user an appropriate error message. Now, I know that when I looked at the stack trace earlier, I saw that it was a SQLite constraint exception. Okay, so I can say if the error is of that type, well, then maybe we can show a different message to the user. Maybe we can show a more useful error message to the user. So I'm going to say if result.getError, if that's an instance of SQLite constraint exception, then let's display a toast to say the word is already there. Okay. Otherwise, maybe we say, well, we failed to insert the word. All right, let's give that a try. Cobra. Hit save. All right, there we go. So word is already in the database. So that'll prevent it from crashing if that word already is there. And it'll also prevent it from crashing if anything else should go wrong, right? So if for some reason we can't connect to the database or other things that might occur, we won't have that application that's then crashing. It'll be giving the user an error message, which still isn't perfect, but maybe that's the best we can do, right? If something's wrong, at least the user knows about it, and the application isn't crashing on them. Okay. Questions? Any questions about that? About handling those exceptions? If yours is still crashing, I would have to look at the actual error message. One suspicion that I might have is that you didn't move this into a task here, that you still have it called to the database directly. Oh, well, if it's with displaying the toast, then that means you still are trying to display the toast in do in background instead of moving that display toast into the on post execute. So this kind of thing of dealing with exceptions, this is definitely one thing I wanted to make sure that we cover. It's actually not covered in 10.1, which is kind of odd. It's like, well, things can fail when you're dealing with the database, but that's not something that's covered in the reading material or the lab. But that's how you solve that. That's how I would solve it. Is it the only way? No, it's not the only way. But I think this is a fairly simple and generic way that you can do it and that's reusable. This doesn't apply to just one problem. So now that we've done it for insert word task, why don't we just go do it for the other tasks that we've created, so that anything that goes wrong there also won't cause a problem. So let's go back up to here. Now what I can see with get all word task, I can see that it's already returning a list of words. Okay. Yes, let's go ahead and let's finish this part real quick, because this will be the end of this part. Will be the end of this section. I'm going to actually start a new stream as soon as we finish this little piece here, and then because I want to go then to the hands-on test review immediately after this. So this should only take a few more minutes, and then we'll go on to the next thing. Then we'll take a break. So here I'm going to change this to return an async task result, and wrap the list in that. And same thing here. This now reads return that async task result list word, and this needs to receive an async task result list word. Okay, so let's try to get all the words, otherwise we'll catch an exception. We want to log that exception. Log tag EX, that's what I'm thinking toast. And then here I need to return a new async task result, and that's the exception. And in the good case, I'm going to get a list of words. Save that to a variable, and then say return new async task result, and that's going to be the words. Okay, so that's my change to do in background, so that it's handling the exceptions, and then in this case we need to do a similar thing to on post execute. So if result dot has error, we're going to display a toast with the message failed to get all words. Otherwise, we're going to display the new word, the list of words. So result and words is equal to result dot get result. There we go. So if anything does occur, anything does go wrong with trying to load the list of words, we'll get an exception that the user can see, rather than it crashing. And we can verify that real quick. So if I go to Word Database, let's say I've got the onOpen method. I know that this runs every time the application starts. If this were to, say, throw an exception, then we would see that there. So throw new null pointer exception. See, there it would say failed to get all words because it ended up having a problem actually connecting to the database. Okay. That's a good point to take a break. We have it now working where you'll obviously want to comment that out, but we have it now working where you can show the list of words from the database, but also have it set up in a way that you can add words. to that database. Now, a reminder from what we did yesterday. Right now, if you leave the app and come back, those words will be lost. But if you change this to on create instead of on open, those words will be preserved. So that's the good way to test it, is change both of those to on, change this to on create. So yeah, I can pull that back up. So that's the last piece here for this part. Let's take a 30-minute break. It's 1:50. We'll come back at 2:20, and we'll start with the hands-on test review.